one of the key components was that the idea that each circle would act like a micro enterprise. So it would be a small business within the ecosystem of Zappos and would identify its customers, be those internal or external customers, and those customers would actually pay for their services. So each circle had its own profit and loss statement. Customers bringing money in, they had their costs. What that enabled was teams to add multiple value streams throughout the organization. Good morning. Good afternoon.
Hey. Yeah, good morning to you, John. Thanks a lot for joining me. I'm doing good today.
Good.
I'm feeling positive and energized. Yesterday, I was on the other side of that. No particular reason, just flipping and flopping.
Of course, yeah.
How you doing?
Doing well. I got my morning coffee, so hopefully I will be awake and energized for today. But yeah, doing well, feeling good. The weather in Las Vegas has started to warm up and be really nice, so that's always a boost to your. I feel like a boost to your mental state, you know.
Sure. So I had a few questions lined up for you today. And what I was hoping to do was to give anyone who listens to this later the opportunity to just hear some of the experiences that I've been hearing from you over the last few years, because I think you've stacked up a lot of experience in your work at Zappos, but in a broader sense as well, just your general deep dive into organizations and what it takes to grow organizations where both the people and the organization can thrive. So I thought it would just be a service to everybody if we could share a little bit of that with others too. So with that said, maybe we could jump straight in. And how about first off, if you were to just kind of introduce yourself a little bit and let people know where you're coming from.
Yeah, sure. So my name is John Bunch. I just finished an 11-year stint at Zappos. And actually started at Zappos as a software developer. And so, you know, some of the work that you're talking about, I would have never guessed in a million years I would be doing at Zappos. But about 3 years into my journey at Zappos, I got an opportunity to be Tony, our CEO's advisor. So this meant following him on a day in and day out basis and really getting connected to things that he was passionate about. And one of the things at that time was he had been doing some thinking and some examination on how Zappos had grown over the years, and really got the sense that things that we used to be able to execute on pretty quickly, we had lost our way on. And sometimes things that used to take a day were now taking 3 months. And this is, obviously frustrating for the company, but also for employees who really just want to do good work on behalf of customers. And if things are taking months to get done, that leads to a lack of empowerment of employees. And so he set out to try to do something about this. And I kind of started along with him on that journey. And really, we fell into this idea through research of self-organization and really trying to structure ourselves more like a city is structured. The research shows that every time the size of a city doubles, productivity per resident goes up by 15%, but the exact opposite thing happens to cities. Productivity per employee goes down as you grow. So we wanted to structure ourselves more like a city and less like a traditional company. And so over the course of the next 7 years, really worked with him on implementing various models. Holacracy was one, something that we developed called market-based dynamics was another. And there were more systems and practices that we put into place. We learned about S3 and brought some of those patterns in. over the course of the next 7 years to really try to help with those challenges that we saw and really make Zappos a better place to be. And so it was a really great journey. And a few months ago, I ended my time at Zappos and am currently kind of figuring out the next phase of my journey. So that's where I show up today with you.
Great. Thanks a lot. Well, what I was hoping to do was to break down a little bit and zoom into some of those specific points you mentioned. Zappos became kind of renowned, for better and worse, for its experimentation with Holacracy. And I know that you played such a central role in helping to introduce Holacracy there. So I'm interested, especially in your experiences and reflections on Holacracy itself and your journey introducing that into Zappos and some of your takeaways from that experience. And then maybe we can get into some of those other things as well that I know are also kind of grew out of that journey, like the market-based dynamics, for example. So.
Yeah. Well, we could spend the whole hour we're going to talk just on our transition into Holacracy, but yeah, so I don't know how familiar your listeners are with Holacracy. Probably fairly familiar, but it's a system for transforming an organization into a self-organized organization. And at the time when we were making that transition, it was kind of the one that we found that we felt was the best codified system for helping us do that. It really was altering the way in which we operated. And anytime you do that, it's going to be a very challenging transition for folks. And so one of my goals throughout was really to help shepherd the journey, however long that was, of all of the folks who were learning about Holacracy and implementing and using Holacracy. And that journey for us took probably about a year and a half or 2 years, company-wide, to do. We started with a few teams, learned lessons, grew out, started with a few more teams, grew out, learned lessons. And so it was, and it was not always an easy road to get there. But I think on the other side of implementing it, we did achieve a number of transformations that really helped the organization. I think one, if I have to reflect back on like the biggest wins and the biggest losses or challenges with Holacracy, probably the biggest win I would say is just breaking down the idea of one person existing in one place in the organization, doing one set of work. And it enabled one person to have multiple roles across the organizations in various circles. And what that allowed for is a more flexible employee experience, and also the ability for teams to kind of discover customer challenges, organize teams around solving those, and then get work done, which if you think back to the reason why we were doing it in the first place, that really speaks to that. So, I think that was, even if you stripped away, 95% of what Holacracy is, and you just enabled that practice, I think that would have been very beneficial for us. So yeah, that was our journey. I'm sure there are many elements of which I'm not kind of filling in the gaps, but I'm sure you'll ask me the things where you'd like me to dig in a little bit more.
Yeah, well, we can get into this a little bit more in a while around the pattern-based approach with S3, because I know, I've had the privilege both of having you attend courses that I've delivered and then co-delivering courses with you. So I'd love to get your insights around that. But before that, backing up a bit, an experience I had in 2014 when I met Bernard, one of the co-developers of S3, was this challenge he put to me of how many organizations I knew of over time that had stayed with the full implementation of the Sociocratic circle method. And my answer to that was I didn't know of any that kind of stuck religiously to that over a period of time. And on further inquiry and asking me what actually happened then, what I reflected was that they keep what they believe works. They adapt certain things if they think it doesn't work as it was originally intended, and they throw out whatever they imagine doesn't work, for better or worse, because sometimes there's merit in understanding what it is you're throwing out before you do so. But nonetheless, this is general human behavior. So you alluded to the fact you might mention some of the, so you talk about the pros of Holacracy, and maybe some of the learning that came later that indicated you might change certain things. And that segues a little bit with what happened over time then, what happened next, because you went pretty full on for a pretty broad implementation of Holacracy, I would say, by the book to begin with, but then things began to evolve and change. So can you give maybe just a couple of examples of what you observed most significantly happening over the coming years in terms of changes from Holacracy by the book?
Yeah. So, our process for implementation was, well, first we spun up a team to help with the implementation. And then we kind of set a goal. We want to be fully on board with Holacracy by the end of the year. And then we kind of left it up. We set that as a company goal and got alignment from leadership around, hitting that goal. But then we left it up to each team to kind of raise their hand and say, we're ready for our time to, be helped through the implementation of Holacracy. And so at the end of that period, at the end of each team's kind of assistance with getting launched into Holacracy, we had them kind of up and running with the full system. So we explained governance, we explained the tactical meetings, we explained projects and actions, the whole system, soup to nuts. And our goal was certainly to get them kind of fully up and running and leveraging it. And I think for the most part, for most teams, we achieved that. And then, as you said, over time, I think teams' practice evolves. And while we did still have a support function for Holacracy and for the practices within it, we really didn't want to be the Holacracy police. So we didn't want to come in and say, stop, you're not doing this thing this exact way. We wanted to be helpful. We wanted to, if any team ever said, we're struggling with this bit of practice, can you come help? Like, absolutely, yes. But we really wanted to resist being the Holacracy police. And so, I think there's different approaches you could take when implementing any system. You could take an approach that's really hard-lined and you have strict adherence to exactly the, what is stated in any given thing. And setting aside kind of the S3 pattern approach, which I imagine we'll get to in a minute. Or you can take a more flexible approach. And we certainly took a little bit more of a flexible approach. So I think that, what really happened on the journey is teams kind of over the course of years, because we're still using Holacracy at Zappos, contrary to what some of the media reports might have you believe. But, teams' usage of it varies quite widely. Some might just use it to, capture what roles they have, but not really evolve them, and might not really run any sort of operations with them in them. Others might use it kind of really religiously. But I do think that there was a tending towards using the components that teams really found value in. I think like the tactical meeting process in Holacracy, which is kind of a structured meeting process, a lot of teams really liked it and continued to use it throughout the years. Whereas, I think the governance process was a little bit less highly utilized or less habituated. They would maybe alter their roles whenever maybe something big changed. But as far as kind of regularly going in and thinking about tensions and what could be changed, I think less teams did that on a more regular basis.
Interesting. So, right, but there's two directions I can go here. Maybe just to drill in a little bit on the governance for a minute. I'll be curious about your opinion, because I've seen over many years now an enormous investment into operations in organizations and improving operations. And it's my opinion that poor governance is an Achilles heel in most organizational systems. And it's not an easy thing to handle governance, especially in a more decentralized way on the one hand, But if you're centralized, it's not easy because you're dealing with complexity. And there's many aspects of complexity you can't manage. You need to harness collective intelligence somehow and synergize that. And you need people to be able to make and evolve agreements in different areas of the organization in a way that's coherent with the whole. And, if my understanding of governance is the kind of intentional installing of constraints that enable the creation of value, and they govern future decisions and actions in some way. So I'm curious about that in Zappos. Like, is it that you settled at a level of attentiveness to governance that was adequate for the need in this particular case? Or would it have been beneficial sometimes for more investment of energy and focus into governance?
I think both are true. I think it was adequate, and I think probably organization-wide we could have benefited from more deliberate focus around it. If that answer makes sense. Go ahead.
Yeah, it does. Well, it leads into the next question, really, because you need organizational management somehow, right? And one of the things that I think Holacracy is aiming to resolve is the issue of both local and org-wide governance somehow. And S3 does the same. The Sociocratic circle method does the same. But if you don't figure out how to do that in a decentralized way, then albeit sometimes quietly and inconspicuously, the organizational management still needs to get handled somehow. So you find players who tend to pick that up and do it anyway. And I'm curious, to the degree that you can say anything about that, what were your observations about how over time that wider domain of the organization was managed?
Yeah. So I think, so I said it was adequate, and yet we could put more deliberate work could have been beneficial. One thing that's interesting is we did still have probably the most active region for governance was kind of in our broadest circle, where a lot of the decisions around, policies that would impact all work, or things like, or structure of kind of the bigger segments of work were happening. That was by far our most active governance area. And some of the teams that were, a project team, for instance, had way less active governance. And I think if I reflect on the reason behind that, one is because the broader kind of company-wide has more kind of tensions coming into that system that need to be processed. So that's one thing. And there's no easy way or informal way to kind of handle or process those tensions. I think what happened oftentimes on the more localized level is teams really would be so close to each other in terms of, the relationships and that sort of thing, that they would feel comfortable just making kind of informal agreements or informal ways of handling the work, where they felt like this process was over suited to what they needed and therefore didn't use it. You kind of talked about like teams will use more or less what they find value in. And so if they feel like a more informal approach gets them everything they need and more, then they'll probably do that. And I think the reflection is that's what happened in a lot of cases. I do think like, and this goes to where I think more work on it could have been beneficial. I think oftentimes teams didn't fully understand or resonate with the value proposition of having governance, even at their localized level. And so that's something that, we did try to teach in kind of the implementation, but I think was an ongoing challenge for us.
Yeah, for us too.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so maybe just to drill into that, well, maybe I can make a guess. I think one of the biggest costs of that, if there's an underappreciation of the value of creating some kind of memory of how distributed intelligence is distilled into agreements to deal with various challenges faced, then there's a danger over time either of like reinventing the wheel, because you kind of go on a loop and forget what was decided to start with, but also that attentiveness to coming back to what you agreed and looking at it with a critical eye to see, okay, what's working and what could be improved, and learning from experience in a more kind of focused and intentional way. For me, I think that's one of the biggest costs of not paying heed to governance decisions. And yeah, okay. Good
Agreed.
guess. Good guess. Yeah. But the kind of ad hoc, around the coffee machine, pop-up governance meeting, absolutely. It makes complete sense to me. And why invest more time into some kind of ritualized process at a given time and space if you can deal with it on the fly as well? So
yeah, definitely.
And one last question on your experiences with Holacracy. And I think this could be the same about whether it's like a very kind of specific process, perhaps, that you're learning, like something like relating to decision making, for example, or a whole framework like this. One of the tendencies and perhaps criticisms that I hear is people can get kind of caught up in trying to adhere to the process itself and lose sight of the customer somehow. And I think Zappos, is well renowned for its extraordinary customer service record. So for me, it's over many years, it's been an example of a customer-centric organization. Did you see any kind of like challenge in that over any period of time, where the process itself kind of became consuming and began to impede delivery of value to customers? Or in your case, were you able to keep that balance quite well?
I would say we were able to keep that balance well. There was one time that kind of sticks out, and that was around shortly after we kind of got most teams onto Holacracy. There was this desire, quite rightly, for people to explore different ideas and new circles and new work that they saw that could be beneficial to our customers. Mm-hmm. And people started doing that. People started experimenting, starting new circles. But one of the challenges that we saw was actually some of our core metrics around customer service started to falter. So, our handle time in the call center, for instance, started to falter. And so that was organizationally a lack of sight on the customer experience. And so we realized we had to do something to address that. I think optimally, in an optimal world, the employees as sensors would sense and adapt. So if employees saw, hey, there's this challenge over here, like I need to readjust what I'm doing to make sure that we're aligned to solving that challenge. I think that's kind of the best case. And from a self-organized perspective, I think that's the optimal case. I think one of the challenges is it's impossible for any given employee to understand the full scope of the organization. And so sometimes one person sees something that another person doesn't see. And therein lies some of the challenge and also some of the opportunity around creating and evolving agreements. And so we adjusted to that and got things back on the right track through making governance and system changes to really make sure that we're prioritizing work around certain key things that we needed for the business. So that was one time, but I would say largely we were able to keep the customer front and center while we made these changes.
Yeah, great. Okay. Well, that segues quite nicely into the topic that I'm most excited about talking about with you today, and that's market-based dynamics. So I remember when I first heard you speaking about this in China, I was completely blown away. There was nothing about it that was new in and of itself, but to actually hear an example of this being applied and how far you'd come with that and the thinking behind it just was really exciting. These days we already had the patent Peach organization, which is attributed to Niels Flagging, but I found reference to this in earlier instances as well. And then more recently, there's a lot of talk about Rendan Hay and higher. I know you were speaking with Emmanuel Quintarelli. So this whole idea of, well, I think that Emmanuel frames it quite well, this enterprise ecosystem enabling organization, or the 3EO as he calls it. But maybe you could say something about like the birth of and the journey with market-based dynamics, what that is, why it's important for people to be thinking about that, and what some of your experiences were.
Yeah. So the birth of it was, we had implemented Holacracy, and it was doing, it had changed the way that we work and some of the benefits that I talked about earlier. But one of the things we realized, kind of going back to that original research around cities being more productive as they scale and organizations not on a per person basis, was that within Holacracy, we were still structuring a lot of the budget and time prioritization allocation in a very top-down manner. And that felt very misaligned with the idea of cities and how markets approach things. And so that really created the genesis for us to implement something called market-based dynamics, which is multifaceted. And but one of the key components was that the idea that each circle would act like a micro enterprise. So it would be a small business within the ecosystem of Zappos and would identify its customers, be those internal or external customers, and those customers would actually pay for their services. So each circle had its own profit and loss statement. Customers bringing money in, they had their costs, usually largely for their employees' time committed to that circle, but also, any other costs that they would have. And they needed to make sure that they were able to break even on that profit and loss. But what that enabled was teams to add multiple value streams throughout the organization. Maybe they initially just had one customer who was like paying them for all of what they did, but they realized we're doing this service, and actually there's other teams within the ecosystem that could also use this service, and create a customer-client relationship there. Or we could actually do a new service offering that would be beneficial and get some new customer chains there. So that's kind of the idea on the whole. And I think the thing that was really great for Zappos within that, you talked about our customer centricity. Our number one core value is to wow through service. And so what that really enabled was internally us to act in that same way, where you were providing value for a customer, be that internal or external, and it was your job to wow that customer. So that was a little bit about the genesis of market-based dynamics.
Yep. And maybe you could say something about some of the challenges and how you solve them in moving more towards that model during your time at Zappos. Because essentially what you're doing is you're enabling a micro enterprise. It's semi-autonomous, I guess. There are some constraints on it. I love the examples you give about, delivering, I'm going to say this wrong, but delivering wow, right, to the customer. There's the need to balance P&L, and something around operating within the values of Zappos as well, right? So these were very loose enabling constraints, but within that, then people were free to innovate and create. But then how did that go? What were some of the challenges you bumped into, and what were some of the solutions you came up with?
Yeah, I mean, the first challenge that kind of comes straight to mind, and it was a bit existential, but Zappos had a very collaborative culture internally, and so often before market-based dynamics, oftentimes teams would help other teams. If I went to your team and said, "Hey, could you help out with this?" Oftentimes they would just say, "Yeah, sure, let's do it." Whatever that thing was. Not all the time, but oftentimes. And so now we move into this market-based dynamics organization, and the conversations became, hey, could you help out with this? And then the team would say, sure, here's our cost for those services. Yeah. And it was really jarring, I think, for a lot of people that didn't understand why we were doing this, the benefits of it, what it would do structurally or organizationally for us. And the funny thing is, actually, nothing ever said that a team couldn't take on work for another team free of charge. But at the same time, if my team helped your team free of charge, I think that's completely fine. But if every day you're coming to us asking for work, and there's a system where we need to balance our P&L, and you're not providing anything to help with that, over time that becomes usurious on that side. So that dynamic was I would say very challenging for people to become accustomed to, and that conversation was that was the biggest thing that we had to work with people on. Be an advocate for them within those conversations. Oftentimes, be like a neutral third party in those conversations around new customer client relationships to help make sure that like the conversation was going in a productive fashion. But yeah, that was definitely the most challenging bit.
Was there any kind of progression around that in terms of over time, there was a change in how people perceive that, or you found a solution is the wrong word, but some kind of both and that would help to mitigate some of the challenges that might have come around that?
Yeah, well, one thing is I think people just got better in those discussions. So like the first time you do something, it's always going to be super weird and you're not going to be great at it. But as it went on, teams who were putting together proposals for work got better at putting together, okay, here's our deliverables, here's what value we're going to provide. And also teams looking for work got better at being clear on what they wanted and what they were able to provide and so forth. And so I think those conversations got more productive as we went forward. Also, I think to a certain extent, teams got better at understanding that they could get new customers for their work, which would bring more money into their circle, which they could then leverage to hire other teams. And so that started to happen more often, and it created less of this zero-sum game sort of mentality and more of, if I can grow and I can provide more value, then I can also hire other teams internally, which is a good thing for everybody. So I do think that, over time, a little bit, there was more of the community vibe around growing this ecosystem. But there were also other teams that just said, I'm here to provide value to one customer, do one thing. I'm going to stay in that lane and not really sway from that. Kind of going back to the Holacracy approach and saying, some teams didn't really use governance that much because they found it more or less not valuable to them. Same thing with market-based dynamics. Some teams just stayed in their lane and didn't really use it to evolve what they did. In a similar way, they found it more or less not useful to what they were providing to the organization. So with any of these changes, there's always going to be a nuanced practice of that. And we certainly found that within market-based dynamics.
Yeah. Well, and of course, you're bringing changes into an existing system that has a lot of latency and a very well-defined culture already. And some of these things could be jarring, and for some people more or less, right? So I imagine the same was true of market-based dynamics as it was for Holacracy.
Definitely.
Yeah. So on that topic then, how you handle something like that, because there's a need for some kind of information management and information flow through the system. You were saying earlier as well about this kind of human sensor network. You've got people who are picking up changes in the environment that may be more or less relevant. It might be more or less relevant to them, but it certainly might be relevant for others, even if not to them. So I am of the opinion that as we move ahead in the future, we are going to need to leverage more technology to be able to handle some of these challenges that we face. And I see a kind of strong tie between effective decentralization in systems and technology to support with that. I know that you've got a background in tech, that you've been involved in developing various solutions yourself. Can you say something about some of the solutions so not just the solutions you came to, but your opinion around what do you think is necessary moving forward in organizations of the future? How can technology support us to organize and collaborate together in more effective ways?
Yeah. Well, I'll just stay on the exact topic that you brought up, like humans as sensors, and those sensors can be throughout the organization. And yet a person is not always, even if they sense something, is not always the best person to take it and run with it or make the change. And so I think what that leads to is a need for technology solutions around these. And I think there's a lot out there. And yet, I really still don't think a lot have been very successful. I think we tried a number of different things at Zappos, for instance. It felt like every couple of years there was a new idea that somebody had for creating an application around idea management. So one was called Hatch, which was like where ideas go to hatch. And a team created this whole process, and it didn't really make a big impact on Zappos. Like, people input ideas, but then the surfacing and execution of them, I don't think ever really got to scale. So I think it's a question both of technology and of practice of systems, and these two things must be very intertwined and both at a very high level to be able to really impact change in this area is my opinion. Tony was always one of the things that sometimes frustrated people about Tony was if you brought, oftentimes I would be with him and somebody would bring in, oh, hey, I saw this happen and, I think it's not right. And I think we could be doing better. That might be something about the employee experience. It might be something about the customer experience. But he would almost always say, okay, what are you going to do about it? So, okay, you've brought this up. Like, I hear it. I understand it. I think there's something there that could be better. What are you going to do about it? And this was oftentimes frustrating because a lot of people they don't want to be the ones to make the change. They want to be the ones to hand it off to somebody else and stop having to worry about it. And so obviously there's pros and cons of the person who experiences it being the change agent. Sometimes that's the right approach, and sometimes I think it's the wrong approach. But yeah, as far as the technology angle goes, it just strikes me that you need good technology to surface, but also good practices to be able to unpack the sense that it comes out of those technology systems.
Yeah, this is a problem we've looked at over the years with software to support and navigate via attention, which obviously is a pattern from S3. But you need, so if you become aware of a driver that seems like it's relevant for the organization, but it's not your responsibility to deal with, and it doesn't make sense for you to deal with it either, then who might be the appropriate people, and how do you get that information to them in a simple, straightforward, and clear way? And this is where I think there's a big role for software support with that in the future. But then you have some challenges around it, especially at scale, right? Because it's like, as a human being, our nervous system is quite well set up, So if I send something through a fingertip, then that information is going to be processed fast and the relevant response is going to happen. But in an organizational system, all of those steps need to happen somehow. And it begins with that information getting to where it needs to so that there's appropriate influence to respond.
Well, and I think the other thing is like the human body, if my finger senses a hot plate, like I'm going to do something about it. One, because I trust the signal. Like I feel it's hot. I trust that it's hot. I'm going to do something about it. But I think in the organizational context, even if you sense something and you pass that along to me and it's my kind of area of responsibility, I might either not see what you're talking about or not sense it the same thing as you, or I might also, I see it, I understand it, but I don't think that it's high priority compared to some of the things that I'm sensing. And so I think that's also part of the challenge is, sensing and raising that tension is one thing, but then having one person sense it and another person process it can sometimes be, often I think the person processing it maybe does not do so in the way that the person who's sensing it really thought it might be processed, or so that's another challenge.
Yeah, and I guess there's a nuance to that, because if I sense something, but I don't think it's related to me, I mean, indirectly down the road, it might impact me because it impacts the organization. But I believe it's relevant and I pass it to you and you choose to deprioritize it against other things, then I think I can rest into that, generally speaking. But if there's a dependency, so I sense something, for whatever reason, I'm dependent on you in part to be able to respond to it in an effective way, or even in a kind of more hierarchy of accountability somehow. It's like I'm dependent on you to decide something in relation to that, because otherwise it impacts me. Then you run into that whole challenge around more collaborative decision making and how you bring people together to be able to harness input from different stakeholders to be able to kind of co-create the way out of that somehow. And maybe that's a kind of question I wasn't expecting to ask you today, but this is one of my observations of Holacracy, is it tends to kind of preference the individual. It's like it's role centric. And it seems like there's a space there also for bringing in patterns that can support those moments when there's a dependency among many stakeholders. And rather than kind of deferring to whoever a lead link is, you've just got a group of stakeholders who are all impacted by this and can bring different perspectives and synergize those towards some kind of solution that's greater than the sum of its parts.
Yeah. So I think if you ask the Holacracy experts about the Holacracy process, they would say it relies on the individual to process the tension, but it is a collaborative process in that there's objections and integration inherent with it, and so that is the way in which collaboration happens is through that process. Mm-hmm. I can tell you from experience, we definitely, I think a lot of people at Zappos did feel like it was oftentimes a selfish practice where it did feel a little bit weird for one person to be kind of guiding and pushing something through, as it were. And we did a lot of work on, I think it was the buzzword of the day for a period of time, and people probably hated hearing it, but co-collaboration and co-elevation were things that we talked a lot about. And oftentimes those were, for us, very informal, gatherings where we bring together people and work on an issue, work on something, and get into that solution space, brainstorming solution space, and come together with something that was mutually appreciated across different stakeholders, and then go forward with that solution. And so that was something that we worked on kind of outside of the holacratic process oftentimes. And I think that was beneficial.
Yeah. And just in case people missed it, because you're perpetually humble, John, but you're also quite an expert in Holacracy, I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of practical on the ground experience for sure.
Yeah, for sure. So Well, we're talking about patterns for collaborative decision making, and we're talking about pulling in patterns when what you currently have is inadequate to bring about what you would expect or wish to see, and about bringing in patterns that respond specifically to needs, not just for the sake of doing it. So on that topic, I met you, first of all, 2.5, 3 years ago. We've had the privilege of seeing each other a few times now, but it was a privilege for me at least. So you took quite a deep dive into S3. You came to Sweden one time and helped co-deliver a couple of courses with Lily and I. And I have to say, by the way, just for anyone who's looking for a superb facilitator and teacher, then John, you are definitely one of the best I've ever had the privilege of working with. But with that sort of flattery aside for a minute, I'm curious about so obviously there was something about S3 that attracted you enough that you would kind of come back to it a few times. And you mentioned earlier you've had some experiences of pulling in certain patterns to fill some of those gaps. But first of all, maybe could you share some of your opinions at this stage in your life based on all of your experiences around this kind of pole between like whole system implementation and pattern-based approach? And I have to just say for the record, I think depending on context, it's all contextual, right? Depending on context, sometimes a whole system approach can be a great stepping stone to start. And I think you've attested to your opinion around that being the case with Holacracy and Zappos. But certainly there are other times when that can result in pulling in a whole bunch of unnecessary protocol that kind of throws a lot of babies out with the bathwater as well. And then retrospectively, you have to kind of go back and put things back together. So, or at least concede to a lot of waste. So could you speak something about your learning around this over the years and where you are today?
Yeah, well, I think what you said is right in that there are advantages and disadvantages to both ways of approaching it. Kind of whole hog implementation or pulling in elements as they make sense. And there's probably situations where a whole hog approach works and others where it would be better to do the other way. I think for our Holacracy implementation, it was kind of we wanted to get the whole company on this one system. And that was our goal. And part of that was from Holacracy. They very much espouse you need to ratify the Holacracy constitution, and the whole organization needs to do it. And part of the reason why they say that is they feel like if part of the organization is doing it and part of it is not, then at that boundary line, there's going to be a lot of friction between that. So that's the approach we took. I think one of the challenges in doing that is it creates an element of force. So you are forcing teams to do this thing. And anytime you have an element of force, there's going to be a natural reaction to that. Just as there would be if somebody pushed you, you have a reaction to that. And so, I think we did things within the implementation to try to make it less forceful. I spoke a little bit about how, we set out this goal. We want to be fully holacratic by the end of the year, but we left it to teams to kind of raise their hand and say, we're ready to start our journey. And so in that way, they kind of had it on their own terms when they were going to do that. But the goal was the entire company would move to Holacracy. So, I think what I really appreciate about S3 is the mindset going into it that pull in patterns as they make sense to both to groups within the organization and to the organization as a whole. Because I think going back to kind of the end experience with Holacracy was that certain teams, after all was said and done, certain teams realistically used some patterns and didn't use other patterns of Holacracy because they found them more or less valuable. So if you can realize that that's going to happen regardless anyway, like unless you really want to be heavy-handed on, you must do everything, And if that's your approach, then maybe a whole hog approach works for you or is what you should go with. But if you're not going to go with that approach, then I think the more sensible option is to do something where you pull in patterns, because you have to realize that, teams are going to evolve into that anyway. So you might as well only bring in the ones that make sense in the first place, and that they think will be good for them and think will be useful. And so, so I think there's a lot of value in that, and something I really appreciate within S3.
Mm-hmm. And I met Bernard in 2014, and in early 2015, we were obviously looking at Holacracy among many other things. And I remember we made a prediction back then when answering the question, what will Holacracy look like in 10 years from now? And our assumption was in 10 years, it would look more like a pattern-based menu, that people can pull from according to need. And recently, you're probably aware that we've got the Constitution 5.0 just being released now with Holacracy. And indeed, it's admittedly only broken down into 5 modules, but they're pivoting more towards a modular approach. And I think that's a good evolution, because it creates a bit of slack for people. The downside, of course, always is that people might overlook things that there are things they don't know are important, right? And that's one of the advantages of a whole system implementation. But at the same time, I think it creates a bit of slack for people and makes Holacracy more accessible, so people can experiment with one thing at a time. So one last question I had around S3. So I still kind of stand by my claim that you can build Holacracy out of S3 patterns. And you can build a ton of other things as well. And that's one of the things I love about it, because it's so flexible as a set of building blocks. But were there any patterns besides those that you could already see reflected in Holacracy and Zappos that especially stood out from S3 that you found useful bringing into Zappos during your time there?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. We had you out to Zappos to deliver some sessions on S3, and that was years after we implemented Holacracy. And I think the reason why we did that is because I saw some of the patterns in S3 that were not really included in Holacracy being very beneficial. A few that come to mind, and I'm going to get probably the exact name of the pattern wrong, but you can correct me. But one's around peer feedback and evaluation.
Mm-hmm. Like peer review.
I really liked peer review. Really liked the approach of S3, the S3 pattern on those, and brought those in certain segments of Zappos used a version of that. The other was around co-collaboration and co-evolution of ideas, because that was already something that we were really leaning into at Zappos. And so some of the patterns around that within S3 were already in the direction that we were going, and yet gave us a little bit more depth into our thinking around those. So those are just some that kind of come to mind for me.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because co-create agreements and proposal forming specifically are definitely useful patterns for people. They can get overused when people misunderstand that ultimately it's good to try and free people up to just get on with creating value for themselves wherever is possible. But it's certainly useful for harnessing distributed intelligence when you're dealing with complex issues, but also when you want to build a sense of ownership around agreements, because if we make it together, then it's our agreement for better or worse. Whereas if you make it, then it's always yours, whether I agree or not somehow. But then the peer review, I think is, there's a lot of people who appreciate peer review, but it's also one of those often underutilized patterns. And I think both for people in roles, but also teams as well, to have that peer input on a regular cadence for looking at celebrating what's going well and also harnessing distributed intelligence to learn actionable ways to improve is a investment that many organizations would do well to look more closely at. So I'm happy that you bring that up as an example there.
Something else came to mind. which is actually the principles, the S3 principles. And I imagine if you look at the principles of Holacracy, although they don't lay them out in that way, there's a lot of overlap there. But I think again, for me, this is probably just me personally and not for Zappos, but I appreciated the principles and the description and the understanding of those principles. I think it helped me deepen my thought process around some of the underlying fundamentals of what it is that we're trying to do, largely.
Yeah. Okay, well, watch this space, because in the next weeks, we're going to be releasing a much more detailed explanation of all of the 7 principles. So that's coming to the guide soon. Okay, well, John, listen, the last thing I wanted to ask you is this. What wisdom would you pass on to others that they might consider in their journey towards developing organizations where people and the organization can thrive?
Well, do we have another hour?
No. I know we need like several calls, because you're a wise guy. But if you were to nail it,
I didn't mean it in that way. It's just such a deep question, with a probably multifaceted answer. But I think for me, many organizations just kind of accept the status quo in terms of the way in which they operate. And obviously now I think there is a trend over, say, the past 10 years of organizations being a little bit more thoughtful about that. But even when you look largely, a vast majority of organizations take a lot of things just as status quo. This is the way that organizations operate, and we're going to operate in that way. So, I think one of the things that hopefully we are doing as people who are experimenting with these different approaches is helping humanity learn about different ways of approaching things. And so, I think one thing that comes to mind is there is benefit in that, but there's also pain and challenge. Anytime you change, there's pain to that. And so I think just having that mental frame of mind with you as you're experimenting with these different things, that what you're doing is beneficial in the long term for your organization, but also for humanity as a whole. And there is going to be pain associated with it, but that makes you stronger, and it makes humanity stronger, and it makes the individuals within the organizations grow and learn and be stronger over time as well. I think is an important thing to constantly reflect on over the course of journeys with some of these different models and different systems, because it's not easy. So that's one thing, and then kind of the secondary, or not secondarily, but alongside of that, I would just say, really be thoughtful about the human impact and the way that you approach it from the side of the people within the organization. Be thoughtful about your approach with that, because any change is not going to be easy for people. So anything that you can do to help support their journey, short and long term, I think is incumbent upon people who are trying to impact these changes to really make it so that people do come out the other side as better, stronger, healthier people.
Bingo to that, man. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
So, John.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm not sure if you want to be found, but if you did, how might people find you?
So I have a small consulting firm, Thoughtful Org Partners. They could find me or email me at john@thoughtfulorg.com. Would be the way to be found. Yeah.
Fantastic. So thanks so much, man, for taking the time. I appreciate you joining me early in the morning for you. It's really fantastic. This call has completely fulfilled my wish to be able to share many of the things that I've heard you speak about today. Is there any last words from you as a way to wrap this up?
I don't have any nuggets of wisdom, that which I've already imparted. So no, just thanks everybody for listening, and thanks for asking intelligent questions, James, and having a dialogue with me about this.
It's a pleasure, man. It's always a privilege to speak with you.